This is the Regular Pastor Podcast, a podcast devoted to regular pastors and regular churches. My name is Landon Coleman. I'm a regular pastor here at Emmanuel Baptist Church in the great city of Odessa, Texas. This is season 5 of the Regular Pastor Podcast, and this is the halfway point. We're going to do 25 books in season 5. We have 12 behind us. We have 12 to go, and here we are on episode 13, talking about a book titled Life in the Negative World by a man named Aaron Renn. The subtitle of this book is Confronting Challenges in an Anti-Christian Culture. So let me tell you about this book and the author. This is a book put out by Zondervan Reflective in 2024, so this is a recent book. This page is 247 pages. There are 40 pages of endnotes at the end, so you're looking at a 200-page book. All in all, this book is made up of an introduction, a conclusion, and then there's 4 parts. Each part of the book has 3 chapters, and so I'll just go through these parts quickly. Part 1 says, Welcome to the Negative World. Part 2 is titled Living Personally. Part 3 is titled Leading Institutionally, and Part 4 is Engaging Missionally. Who is Aaron Renn? Aaron Renn is a journalist and a management consultant. He's a senior fellow at American Reformer, and he's a former senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute for Public Research. He's a former partner at Accenture. His writing focuses on issues relating to cities and culture and men's issues in the evangelical church. So that's an interesting combination of subjects to specialize in: cities, culture, men, and evangelicals. If you look at his website, he explains his ministry or his work or his focus in life with this quote: Today, my focus is on helping conservatives and the American church rise to the challenge of finding success in the 21st century. So let's talk about the big idea of this book, Life in the Negative World. On page Roman numeral 15, Renn says this book is about the shift to the negative world, what that means, and how to live in this new reality. And if you keep going, he talks on about page 6 and 7 about the 3 worlds. He's sort of breaking down American history or recent American history into 3 different what he calls worlds. So there was at one point a positive world. That's 1964 to 1994. Then there was a neutral world, 1994 to 2014. And now, according to Renn, we live in the negative world, 2014, all the way up to the present. With this framework in place, Renn wants us to think about our individual lives as Christians, and he wants us to think about our institutional lives in the realm of education and business and organizations, churches, and then he specifically wants us to think about our missional responsibilities as Christians and members of a church. So I want to give you some important ideas. I've pulled all the key important ideas that I'm going to talk about from the final part, to the final section, part 4, that deals with the mission of the church. And so let me talk to you about chapter 10. The title of chapter 10 is Be a Light. And in chapter 10, Renn makes a helpful distinction between evangelism in the positive and the neutral world and evangelism in the negative world. And he points out that in the positive and the neutral world, you could assume that people knew a lot more about the Bible and Jesus and Christianity than you can assume today. And because you can no longer assume that people know those things, today you have to invest more time and energy and thought in what he calls pre-evangelism. I think, just as one example, Renn is overly positive, overly optimistic about the He Gets Us campaign, but his argument for it is in this category of what he calls pre-evangelism. And so he just describes when you live in the negative world now and you're trying to be missional, You have to tell the truth boldly. You have to live biblically to show a better way. And you have to be a person of integrity wherever the Lord has placed you. You have to build trust with people, because we no longer have the built-in trust or the built-in cultural assumptions about Christianity that we used to rely on. And so there is more pre-evangelism that has to go into our efforts to share the gospel and to be missional. So, few thoughts about chapter 10, helpful stuff. In chapter 11, the next chapter, Renn is talking about being a source of truth. And the specific issue he's focusing on in chapter 11 is gender. And Renn just makes the obvious observation that people are flocking to voices like Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan, because those men speak honestly about gender and biology and sexuality. They try to back up their claims with scientific research and studies and data. And he's making the point that pastors have to speak with equal clarity about these issues. And all too often, pastors feel maybe the pressure to nuance everything that they say about these topics. But Renn is saying, no, pastors need to speak clearly about these issues. I would say, just by way of critique in chapter 11, that I disagree with his take that complementarianism is a modern theological system developed in the 80s in response to feminism. I don't view complementarianism as a reactionary idea. I certainly don't view it as a third way type position. I appreciate what Renn says in this chapter as he critiques egalitarianism. I even appreciate his critique on what he calls thick complementarianism and the patriarchy, but I don't necessarily share his perspective when it comes to thin complementarianism, focusing on the role of men and women in the life of the church and in the home. So chapter 11, thinking about the question or the issue of gender, Christians have to be a source of truth, and this is not something we can just back down on as we're trying to be missional in the negative world. Chapter 12, this last chapter here that I'm going to talk about in the fourth section is called Being Prudentially Engaged. And he's talking about politics here. And I just appreciate his honesty in this chapter about the fact that America does have a two-party system, and that two-party system is not going away. I think he rightly critiques the pietism of an Anabaptist type approach to withdrawal, just saying we don't want anything to do with any of this. I think he rightly critiques those who want to aggressively culture war on every single possible issue that comes up. I think he rightly suggests that evangelicals should do a better job at getting involved in running for local offices when possible. And I think that he is right in suggesting that evangelicals need to rethink what they're getting from their support for the Republican Party or the GOP. He's not saying, and I'm not saying, that conservative Christians ought to abandon the GOP, but he is honest enough to say that evangelicals get ripped off by the GOP. They are used, and they are often marginalized by the Republican Party when it actually comes to policy and delivering on the things that matter to evangelical voters. Let me give you a favorite quote. This is from page 192. It's from the chapter that I've just been talking about. He makes this comment, 192. The current skirmish line in the culture war seems to be whether transgendered male-to-female athletes should be allowed to compete in girls' sports. If that's where the fight is presently, one could arguably conclude that the culture war has already been lost. That's something to think about. Where we currently fight the battles of the culture war are so far to the left. That Overton window has moved so far to the left because of the radicalization of liberal politics, the Democrat Party, the left in the U.S. We are fighting battles in places that it just seems pretty obvious that large parts of the culture war have already been lost. And this just makes you think about the issues that we're going to draw a line on, the issues that we're going to devote time to, and how evangelicals can best spend their time and where they can best give their political allegiance, living as Christians in what Renn describes as this negative world. There was this positive world where culture was generally inclined to be supportive of Christianity and Christian values. There was a neutral world where culture was more or less indifferent to Christianity, but we have now moved to the negative world, where the powers that be are increasingly openly hostile to the Christian faith and to Christian doctrine and even to Christian people. Ministry takeaway. I think you got to know the culture you live in. You got to know the people that you're trying to reach, the people that you're trying to serve. If you don't understand the times in which you live, it's awful hard to engage people where they're at on the issues that they think about, they care about. It's really easy, if you don't understand the times in which you live, to just talk past people, to talk around people. You never really address issues that are on the minds of the people that we're actually trying to reach with the good news of the gospel. Let me say a few things by way of critique. I think it is always easier to diagnose a problem than to solve a problem. I think in this book, Renn has hit on something that's real, and pastors need to recognize and understand this idea of a positive world, a neutral world, and a negative world. However, in terms of a positive path forward, I don't think there's a whole lot here, and there are times in the book where it just feels like Renn's talking out of both sides of his mouth in his proposals for moving forward. I'll be fair to Renn. He says in the very introduction that the book is light on solutions, and he argues that the lack of a positive vision doesn't really take away from the helpfulness of the diagnosis, and I would tend to agree with that. I think the diagnosis here is helpful, even if the path forward is not perfectly clear or argued in a convincing way. So if you look this book up on Goodreads, you'll find it coming in with a 4.24 rating. I gave it a 4-star rating. I think the diagnosis is great. I think the critique is really helpful in places. And then I think the path forward that Renn charts is less than clear and less than convincing in various points. Who's going to read this book? I think pastors should read it. I think committed Christians who are concerned about the world in which we live should read it. I think if you're an influential businessman or an educator or a politician and you are a follower of the Lord Jesus, I think this is a book that you should read and try to understand. Thanks for listening to the Regular Pastor Podcast. You can subscribe online wherever you listen for weekly episodes. You can follow me online at regularpastor.com. You can find me on Goodreads. Send me a friend request. Search for Landon Coleman. And if you've got a book recommendation you'd like for me to talk about a particular book on the podcast, let me know. Landon at emmanuelodessa.com. Until next week with the second half of Season 5 in the Regular Pastor Podcast, this is the Regular Pastor.